Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel on digital defense, cybersecurity, and national security. In a time where cyber threats are increasingly tied to global conflict, critical infrastructure, and national security, understanding how we defend ourselves in the digital space has never been more important. Today, we'll be hearing a policy proposal that addresses this challenge head-on, followed by a discussion with senior defense official and an open Q&A with the audience with the mic runners. Please hold all questions until after the policy proposal. It's an honor to welcome General Frank McKenzie to our panel today. General McKenzie served as the commander of United States Central Command from 2019 to 2022, where he oversaw U.S. military operations across the Middle East and parts of Central and South Asia. Throughout his distinguished career in the Marine Corps, General McKenzie played a critical role in shaping national security strategy with a deep expertise in cyber operations, joint force planning, and modern warfare. We're incredibly fortunate to have his insight today as we explore the evolving landscape of digital defense and cybersecurity threats to national security. Next, I'd like to introduce Sandra Malloy, a student from USF majoring in criminology, who has developed a comprehensive policy proposal focused on building a national threat intelligence network, establishing cyber rules of engagement, and pushing for international cyber norms.
So we have recognized that in the 21st century that power is no longer defined by your physical weapons capabilities or your military size, but by information, who controls it, how you control it, how do you protect it, and if you can weaponize it, and how you can weaponize it. It's in a time where we are relatively vulnerable across the entire world to cyber attacks and a lot of ransomware. So in the last decade, we've seen a very rapid evolution in cyber warfare. It's no longer just like what we think of like a guy in a hoodie in a basement. It's state-backed, it's funded, and it's military-level digital sabotage. So like in 2020, we saw the SolarWinds breach where it's been attributed to Russian intelligence, but we saw the compromise of the Department of Homeland Security, the Treasury, and Commerce, and then in 2021, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, where a lot of fuel across the Southeast, creating long gas lines, a lot of public panic, and then the attackers weren't a foreign army, they were a criminal group that was within the US, and then also in 2021, we all saw how Microsoft got shut down by a ransomware. It stopped a lot of schools, it stopped a lot of hospitals. So not is it only just in the, like what we think of in the government level of military, but also in like everyday structures. You couldn't go to an ER, you couldn't go to school and do your normal jobs. So it's not just whether or not we can do something on a military aspect, but a lot of the critical like infrastructure and architecture that we have in not just the US, but across the globe. So we have three large gaps in like the cyber defense and cyber ransomware. We don't share cyber information nearly as fast or as much as we should. There's no international agreement on what's considered off limits. We have countries and groups that just continue to push the boundaries and see what they can get away with and see what we will call them out on. And then we don't have any clear rules in the US of how we deal with cyber attacks, what we do on certain occasions, what we consider sabotage, what we consider espionage. So one of the goals of my policy is to create a centralized network for real-time information sharing. So that way it's like a connection of like a military compound, like a digital version of a joint military command. So it brings together federal agencies, private sector leaders, the ones that have stakes in it. So energy, finance, defense, communications, so that most of the time when ransomware happens, it's not on a public sector thing as the first start. Most of the time it starts in a hospital or it starts in a private sector security firm. If they were able to communicate with like the Department of Homeland Security and be able to tell us when these things happen on a faster level, we can react more and we would have more data on what is actually happening, when it's happening, and how to deal with it. So most likely this network will be overseen by the Department of Homeland Security and closely linked to US Cyber Command and most likely the NSA. But right now, private companies are the first to notice suspicious activity, so making sure that they also have a stake in it. Not necessarily probably a partnership just because they are private companies, but making sure that they can either access this network or give information into this network. So being able to start with energy, finance, defense contractors, and then possibly using AI. It was talked about in the first panel, being able to use these as like threat detection systems. So not being able to fully rely on them, but being able to see if they can help in making sure that maybe we can catch these things before a human eye can. So kind of like ORAD for cyber defense. But right now there's like if you go into like the second part of my proposal, there's no clear global consensus on what behavior is acceptable in cyberspace. So without rules, a lot of cyber attacks have been launched on hospitals, election systems, water supplies, with no sense of fear of what the actual consequences could or would be. So if we created some sort of international cybersecurity treaty, which hopefully would be led by the US, would be able to level the playing field in a lot of cyber defense and a lot of cyber competition. So there'd be global norms for cyber conduct. So what's off limits, what's allowed in a sense, prohibiting attacks on essential civilian infrastructures, hospitals, schools, utilities, and then requiring shared like attribution efforts, so with allies and things like that, so that states can't hide third-party hackers, and then enforcement mechanisms like a cyber arbitration council or joint investigative unit, and then making sure that we have a strong commitment for information sharing, especially with our allies. We've recognized that we're at a time where allies can mean a lot of things to us, so making sure that we have this treaty, making sure that we include everybody, because the existing Budapest Convention on cybercrime is a good start, but it has no actual teeth when it comes to making sure that things are held to the standard that they should be, especially because it doesn't have the support of key players like China and Russia. So if we did something through the UN or through NATO, it would make sure that these things are connected just a little bit more and that there's a little bit higher standards and more defense on a global scale. And then doing cyber rules of engagement. Right now, whenever we have a sort of ransomware attack or a cyber attack, we kind of learn as we're going, but if we had rules of engagement, we would be able to better react. So different thresholds of different levels of attack, so like espionage versus sabotage, response protocols for but not only civilian systems, but military systems, and then safeguards for escalation or unauthorized retaliation, just to make sure that if other countries do cross the line, we don't cross that line in return. And then if we publish like a declassified version of them, it could strengthen a lot of deterrence to being like, you know what will happen if you cross that line, so we highly suggest you do not. And it's gonna take a while to implement, but I think that these three objects would allow not only for the US to lead the new cyber defense realm, but making sure that we can keep a prowess in the cyber defense realm because it's ever growing, it's ever changing, we need to learn on the spot, but being able to know where to keep going and where to actually keep that information would allow the US to lead on a global scale.
Thank you for that, Sandra. General McKenzie, did you have any insight on that?
First of all, that was a great presentation. Thank you, Sandra. I really enjoyed it. There's not a lot for me to disagree with in there, actually. But what I thought I might do is just take a minute to give a little context before we get into the Q&A. You know, we in the U.S. military, we think about domains of warfare: air, sea, land, and recently, over the last few decades, we think about space and we think about cyber. And the fact of the matter is, the cyber domain is more demanding than the space domain. The net is vast and infinite, as has been said. It maps the human mind. So there's really no end of where you can go with the internet, with the cyber universe that's out there. So we need to remember that when we think about it. The other point is, the United States is the most powerful nation in the world in terms of cyber offensive capabilities. When I was on active duty, I'd go up every couple of months and visit the director of the National Security Agency and the commander of Cyber Command, a good friend of mine named General Paul Nakasone, an Army 4-star general. And I'd spend a day with him, and we would talk about what was going on in cyber. And unfailingly, I'd come out of his office afterwards, my knees would be weak, and I'd stumble to the car, and the first thing I'd want to do once I got in my vehicle was throw my phone away. And the next thing, I would want to swear I never wanted to be in the room with a computer that was on again. There's a famous science fiction writer, a guy named Arthur C. Clarke. Some of you may have heard the name. He once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And what the United States can do offensively is in fact magic. However, here's the other side of that coin, and really getting back to the points you made, we are the most vulnerable nation in the world to cyber attack for a variety of reasons. One, by the simple nature of our society, the technologically advanced nature of our society, the fact that everything rides on some form of internet backbone to get things done, whether it's our air traffic control system, hospital SCADA systems, or nuclear power plants, a little more protected there, but still vulnerable to some degree. We are uniquely vulnerable. And you called out a number of reasons. We don't have an effective national policy. We don't have a deterrence policy where we tell people, look, if you shut down the air traffic control center of the United States, there will be repercussions. We actually haven't established that. And we don't have good rules of engagement for what we might do in cyber. Just to cite one example, the topology of the web doesn't match the topology of the world. So if we could be being attacked by something, and the servers could be in Switzerland or Mumbai or Utah. So you have to, the legal system has not caught up to those concepts. So how do you execute then operations, cyber operations, against something that is in a nation that's an ally of ours, but nonetheless is basing a cyber attack against us that could very well be very powerfully effective. These are all critical problems, and you've called them out very well. I mean, the thing that resonates the most to me though is we do not have an effective national policy. So the organization that I'm the executive director of, in addition to GNSI, here at University of South Florida, is an organization called the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. Many of you have heard the name. Cyber Florida was established back in 2014 because the legislature wasn't happy with how the executive branch in Florida was dealing with cyber issues. So it's an attempt to put a Band-Aid on a problem. Now, by establishing something like Cyber Florida, the state of Florida is actually in the front rank of states in the way they respond to cyber issues. But I would argue, because again, there are no boundaries here, you really need national level responses. And we haven't seen any administration recently with an appetite to impose national level cyber responses. Cyber policies is probably a better way to say it. There are pockets of excellence out there. The Department of Defense can protect itself pretty good. But that's good so far as it goes, but the Department of Defense needs the rest of the internet in order to actually do anything, and that is not protected. And that's just in the public national security sector. The weaknesses are even more pronounced in across the other sectors that we take a look at when we consider cyber. So I think your prescriptions are very reasonable, and I look forward to a more detailed discussion of them.
Thank you, General McKenzie. We'll open it to Q&A from the audience if anyone has any questions. I know that you were talking about the military's role and the DoD's role in protecting critical infrastructure. I was curious to know what role do you think the military and the DoD should play in protecting private sector infrastructure critical to national security?
Sure. So that's the problem is that's a slippery slope. You don't want to militarize these functions in our society. That's not good. It's not good for the nation in the long term if you do that. So I think what you depend the national security space to do, and by that I mean the military, the intelligence agencies, all of those entities that look at what's going on in cyber. I think what you get from them is warning and what we call indications and warning. Something bad is here. But the other thing is, over the last 60 years ago, most of the innovative intellectual work in defense and cyber was being done inside the Department of Defense. That's now being done outside the Department of Defense. So private businesses, cyber companies, cyber defense companies often have a better product than what's available inside the Department of Defense. So that's a change, that the landscape has changed, if you will, over the last few decades. Privatization has had a powerful effect on this. So I would go back to the role of the military ought to be warning, but I think the nation actually has the resources necessary to defend itself, and those don't need to be military resources, but they need to be marshaled, and that's going to require, again, national level policy, national level guidance, and national level incentives to states to do these things. What you got now are states like Florida, again, doing some good things, other states not so much. Good question.
My next question was going to be, How does the Department of Defense currently define thresholds for escalation in the cyberspace?
Great question. Poorly. So it is difficult to know, if you're an adversary, it's difficult to know what you have to do to provoke the United States. And that's not the way, the concept of deterrence is you want to be very clear, if you do this, there will be repercussions. But if we haven't established those, or they're fractured or uneven, then that invites people to continue to probe till they find that line. And so a miscalculation on the part of the potential attacker based on the defender's inability to define red lines and actions that we might take is a prescription, I would argue, for potential disaster. And that's broadly the scenario we're in today. Sooner or later, there's going to be a massive cyber disruption in the United States caused by probably a state actor, maybe a non-state actor, but the resources of a state are so much greater than the resources of a non-state actor that it's probably going to be a state actor, and then we're going to be in a crisis, and we're going to have to make some fundamental decisions.
My name is Max. Had my undergrad in political science, and I'm currently doing a MS in cybercrime, former military. So we have, the U.S. is evolving with the terms of cyber, in the cyber field. We created our other branch for cyberspace, and we're also building the FBI Center out in Alabama. So we're on terms tracking for what the capabilities of cyber harassment from other entities are. And currently, our model for basically handling issues, criminals and criminality is basically adapting or putting criminologists, what they're doing is using regular additions of how we treat crimes, adding it to the cyber field. So in acts of overseas are actors within state, that would be basically terrorism. So we adapt these terms to identify what is being done, who is being done by, and extradition laws. So if it's a actor that is foreign but doesn't have ties to the US, what are extradition laws? And if it's someone that is in our cycle or within our countries that we deal with, how do we go about that? But my question is, so the crimes that are being committed, because she asked, how are we going to deal on it with a national level? Should we deal with it on just the adaptation of how we deal with crimes now? Or should we create a new policy? Because it's basically widening the broad of government and how we deal with those actors. But I feel that we already have those laws in order and how we deal with certain actors. It's just that, is it known to the majority? And should certain crimes be known to the public because of certain outrage that the public might fear? Does the government want the public to fear knowing all these things are going on? And so do they keep us distracted with the media? Because certain things, if the public did find out, more outcry, more distress would occur.
Yeah, I can say a few things. So I used to be on a newspaper, and I do a lot of things in journalism. I can definitely say that the media's perspective isn't always the correct perspective. But when it comes to like the extradition and the new policies when it comes to international, we can probably adhere a few of our current policies when it comes to extradition laws, and add to them when it comes to the cyber realm. But I don't believe we have any specific extradition laws that adhere to the current cyberspace. You can probably adhere a few of them based off of like moral code and things like that. But we would either need to create new policies or change old ones to be able to encompass those. I don't think that when it comes to the cyber realm, the media is doing a good job of covering it properly, let alone the policy when it comes to covering it properly. The media goes after what gives them money, or at least most of them do. So if we wanted to get support for things like that, we would need to either get the backing of the media or hope that at least the US population will back us even without the media.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. The problem is, first of all, in determining actors abroad, criminal actions today can also be related to state-driven actions. So it's kind of hard to divide the two, although ultimately we are very good at finding attribution. If somebody working in a room in Southern Europe using a server in Delaware does a denial of service attack in California, we're eventually going to solve that problem, because this is important. The resources of a state in cyber, particularly this state, the United States, is vast resources. We can apply a lot of things to it to find out who actually did it. Not everybody can do that. The Russians can probably do it. The Chinese can probably do it. The Israelis can probably do it. There may be a couple other nations that can do it, but not everybody can do it. But we can certainly do that and find out who is behind that attack. The question is going to be then, what's the nature of the attack? Does it rise to a level where you might actually do something back militarily? And if it's a criminal, probably not. So you get your very good question about extradition. I would argue that most of those laws are appropriate and on the books today, and that we just have a need to exercise them. We also have a need to be clear and public in our policy as we approach that problem. And I don't know that we've always done a good job of that. The last point, and you hit it a little bit, Sandra, was really, you're right, a lot of what goes on in cyber doesn't break the noise level because there's so many other things going on. I don't believe that's the result of any policy. I believe it's just the result of, that's the way we do things in this country. Everybody's got a very short attention span. So we had a launch yesterday in Texas, sent 6 people into orbit. Everybody's focused on that right now. Probably not thinking about what's going on in cyber. Eventually, that's going to change because there's going to be a massive disruption attack in the United States. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And then a lot of these things are going to be resolved. Probably, though, too late. You prefer to resolve them on the front end so you can deter that from happening or prevent it from happening. But in the American way, we'll probably deal with it after the crisis. It's a good question. Thanks for asking it.
I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit with my question to more of a tactical perspective, obviously with your experience as a combatant commander at Central Command. And we've seen in the war in Ukraine how cyber is not just always a strategic threat or an infrastructure threat, but it can be used in the battle space. And I was wondering if you had any kind of perspective from being a combatant commander on tactical level assets, whether it's air defense or command and control. And we've seen how those have been attacked in Ukraine successfully and unsuccessfully. What were you worried about when you were at CENTCOM for your troops, for your assets? And have you seen growth, whether your time there or being retired now, have you seen growth in our preparedness on a tactical battle space level for those assets?
First of all, great question. Thank you. I would tell you that cyber changes month to month. It is that dynamic. It's profoundly dynamic. And I watched it change in the 3 years I was in command pretty significantly, and I watch it from afar now in Ukraine. But I guess the first point I'd make is tactical cyber. I thought about it every day. It was embedded in everything I did. I worried about it all the time. But when you talk about the military application of cyber, here's the argument. The argument is always between the intel guys and gals who say, look, we're in their systems. If he's using his phone, golly, we can see him. Think about that. So that's a pretty profound thing. If I can get in so completely in his instrument that I know everything he's doing with it. And I said, well, look, I got that, but I want to launch a strike here. And in order to do that, I'd like to bring down their air defense. He's an officer in their air defense. I need to bring down his communications. And so they say, well, okay, that's really short-term gain. So you're going to do that. We're going to shut them all down. We're going to marry a non-kinetic effect, shutting down phones and other things, to a kinetic effect. We're going to strike them with missiles, perhaps, or other things. and bang, the event's going to be over. The event will be fine. But now he's going to redo all his cyber security. So we're going to have to start from scratch. That's the eternal argument between the operators and the intel people. And so I was in a place where I was typically the arbiter of those decisions at some levels, and at some levels it was above me. You're going, what would say, across the river to the White House to get those answers in some things you're doing. So, but you think about that all the time. Now, okay, what's happening in cyber right now is you're seeing in Ukraine where a lot of drones are being used, and now the drones are being jammed. Early on in the war, not a lot of effective jamming was done of drones, particularly by the Russians. But now, very effective jamming is going on. So you're having to answer that in one of two ways. Many people don't realize this. There are drones flying in Ukraine now that are trailing behind them a monofilament wire that may be 50 kilometers in length. Think about that. So the battlefield's draped in wire now, but so you can control your drone. Problem is, it's a complex way to control a drone. The wire can break. There are a lot of reasons why that's not the desired solution. So if you can't do that and you can't talk to your drone's got to be autonomous. And now that takes you into a whole new country. If the United States, we've been hesitant to embrace autonomous battlefield operating systems, culturally, ethically, for a lot of reasons. People that are in a fight have a tendency to be more direct about it. So now your drone has got to be able to function in an environment where it'll have to make basic decisions for itself. We fly over here, there's a white car here. What are we going to do with a white car? Well, it might be you're going to orbit the white car and report on it. Or it might be if it's a white car and it heads north, you're going to attack it. You can provide all kinds of parameters to a drone. But increasingly, the fact of the matter is the ability to pass vast amounts of information off satellites, line of sight, is being challenged. And that is, for me, that's the biggest change we're seeing in drone operations over the last couple of years. Drones are going of necessity to become increasingly autonomous. And that's going to have eventually, we're going to be faced with that. 2 years ago, I would have said I'm not in favor of the United States deploying autonomous systems. My position's changed on that. And I think it's inevitable that we're going to have to deploy autonomous systems. I mean, the next generation fighter that the Air Force just awarded to Boeing a couple of weeks ago is going to follow the F-35. That airplane is going to almost certainly, A, be optionally manned, doesn't have to have a crew, optionally crewed, and B, it's always going to be accompanied by unmanned wingmen of some kind. 2 or 4 wingmen that are going to fly with it. And then so now, again, in a denied environment, how are you going to do that communication? Shorter ranges are easier than long ranges, so you can probably connect it to the airplane. But the airplane's not going to be able probably to talk back to home plate and talk back to base because the environment's going to be so denied. If there's a thing that we have fallen behind in this country in the last several years, it's not recognizing that denied space, because our systems are so exquisite and they're very good when they can talk and communicate. So we sort of don't want to face the future where we might not be able to do that.
I crafted this question because our professor is prior cybercom, so I'd love to get your opinion. Given the increasing reliance on special operation forces on digital infrastructure for command and control, how vulnerable are these units to cyber attacks from adversaries? And what strategy measures are being taken to harden soft cyber resilience without compromising operational agility?
Sure. So again, a real good question. The only way to really ensure that you're not going to get inside somebody's system is to have a closed loop. I'll give you an example. The United States system of nuclear command, control, and communication, it gets people laugh at it all the time because they use those big floppy disks, those 7-inch floppies that probably none of you in this room have ever seen. But that's the way we used to do it back in the 80s, 70s. And so we still use that in our nuclear command and control system. But you can't get into that system. So there's the downside. It gets dated. The upside is you can't get in it. And that's really what you want with nuclear systems. However, those are very very discrete, very unique systems. You've got any other system you're going to apply tactically, you've got to be able to update it. It's got to be able to talk. And if it can talk, it's vulnerable. simply the degree to which you can get inside there. The U.S. standard is link 16. That's just a term that refers to our data link that we use. There's some concern the Chinese have cracked link 16. So that's a concern because that's the gold standard for communication. And if they can get in there, then they can read your files. So, we always tend to believe that our systems are perfect. There's a thing called the Venona papers. Some of you may know what those are. It refers to a large trove of Russian, Soviet intelligence reports on the United States from the United States in the 40s and 50s. So when they sent these reports home, we couldn't break that code, but we kept them. And over time, computing has advanced in power. We've finally been able to break that code and read all these reports from many years ago. So what's the lesson? The lesson is anything is breakable eventually. It's just how long is it going to take for it to be breakable? I mean, the Japanese were confident that the IJN code was secure. The Germans were secure and confident that the Enigma code, particularly they used with their submarines, was secure. Well, it wasn't. And so that's when I hope, and I believe we do, have a properly humble view about the ability to protect against these systems, protect the ultimate security of these systems. But again, for a tactical system, you don't need it to be good for 10 years. You need it to be good for maybe 10 months, maybe 10 weeks, something like that. So you're right, we are right to be concerned about that. And so the only way to protect against that is constant vigilance, constant updates. It's amazing, and you just shift gears for a second in the private sector. We did a study of Florida to look at critical infrastructure protection, and we found that over half the institutions in Florida don't actually mandate and strictly require, two-factor authentication when you come on a computer. Over half. The same ones typically were months behind in their patches. So patches, I know, are a pain in the butt. I recognize that. But look, when Microsoft or Apple puts out a patch, it's not because they want to make the monitor look prettier like they say. It's because they've uncovered a significant security problem, and the patch needs to be made immediately. Any patch ought to be loaded the minute you get it, not the next day, not the next week, but across Florida, institutions that you'll be surprised at are like months behind in their patches. And so that, again, ties back into your very good question about that. Thank you.
Appreciate the event and thanks for the opportunity. Sir, the title on the screen in this segment basically alludes to JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which I'm sure you're familiar with, connecting all sensors and all shooters together. Huge lift. That is the ultimate goal of the DoD. In your opinion, what policies and strategies do we need to get there? And also, if you have a better description than my caveman understanding of JADC2, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So what we would like to pursue is a tactical universe where everybody can communicate with everybody. If I sat when I was the CENTCOM commander, let me give you an example. If I sat down at a terminal in a Patriot battery, a surface-to-air missile battery in Saudi Arabia, one of my batteries there, I could sit down, I could look at a monitor, and I could see what was happening up in Iraq, see what was happening up in Jordan, see what was happening at sea. All that information is seamlessly shared. That's sort of the concept, and that's a Link 16 thing. It goes on Link 16. So we are unique in our ability to try to do that. Other nations have tried to copy it with varying degrees of success, but we are uniquely head and shoulders above everybody else. However, there's still a long way to go. I cite Patriot because that's an easy thing. You want to be able to pass targeting data. You want to be able to pass intelligence information. And that's really what JADC2 is getting after. It's an acronym for All Domain Command and Control. And we've made some useful steps in that direction. But I'm still a little bit a pessimist about it because I believe the ability to disrupt is always greater than the ability to cohere. So there are more ways to make that not happen by the opponent's action than there are our way to hold that image together. And so the thing is, you still need people at the very lowest level who suddenly lose that godlike view of the world to be able to operate. And that requires all kinds of trainings, like being on a ship. Like I own a boat. I've got electronic plotter on the boat. I like the electronic plotter. I'm not real good at it, but it shows me where I am. But I also have paper maps in case the electricity doesn't work. That's a sort of an analogy for how we need to be able to be here to prepare for that. The other thing is you now all your information is traveling in that cloud. If someone can penetrate that cloud, they are going to have all your information. So I think we still got a way to go on this in this concept of command and control, which is not a bad concept of command and control, and I support it, but we just got a long way to go. Did that get to your question?
Sir, it did. I was just curious if you think there's any overarching policies or strategies, because that's the direction we're moving.
Yeah, so you got a new team in office now. It's probably going to change a little bit, I would guess. But in terms of, it needs to be a Department of Defense driven concept going down. They have not necessarily, and the Joint Staff needs to grasp that. I don't know that they've done that. In answer to your question, I can't see that there's a real clear overall concept. But I don't watch it like I used to, thank God. Thanks.
So I know we talked a lot about state actors and how they have a lot of resources to actually attack the United States. And for us to even revamp the whole system that we have, it typically takes some large-scale event happening that will probably happen by a state actor. However, I was wondering, since computers are pretty much ubiquitous in society, everyone has a phone or an app or like some technology that they can access. What do you think about non-state actors and just small groups in entirely different countries that now have the resources to somewhat attack U.S. Data or infrastructure without even being in the U.S. and probably being in countries where we don't have a lot of jurisdiction to even ask our allies if they can extradite them and bring them over? So
yes, you're right to all that. There are non-state entities out there that seek to attack us and have some success in doing that aren't related to a state. And there are also non-state entities that are supported at several removes by a state because it's expensive to do this kind of work. But let's just stay with non-state entities for a minute because it's a reasonable question. Yeah, so we actually do a reasonably good job of looking at that because the level of sophistication they can bring is not like you're going after, a unit in Russia that's doing it or a unit in China that's doing it. They have vast, again, just a lot more resources to throw at the problem. These can be very good because they're brilliant people out there that don't work for a state, and they can be very effective with those attacks. But they're not going to be broad. They're not going to be deep. They could still be very, very dangerous, and I don't want to minimize that. But ultimately, you're going to be able to track them. You're going to be able to corral them in a way that will be a lot harder to do if it were a state entity. I don't mean to play that down. It sounds like I am because they can cause a lot of pain, and they do cause a lot of pain. But it is still qualitatively different than an attack by a nation state.
With that being said, talking about state actors and how they do attack the U.S. infrastructure, does anything change? Like, for example, I know earlier during this conference, ISIS was brought up, and they're talking about the types of things that they were doing over there. That is kind of state actor, where they had troops on the ground doing things. Transferring everything over to cyber now, and how we have state actors in many different spots now because everything is on the internet and online. Does that change U.S. response too? Because previously we could just go over and bomb them, but now everything being cyber and online. Is there like large changes that need to be had when it comes to
so
US response?
let's take ISIS for a minute. So, like ISIS is clumsy in the cyber domain. They're not. Many of their good computer guys are dead, but they still got some. But how ISIS attempts to reach into the United States is actually not through attacking the Hillsborough County water system, but rather by giving you radicalization opportunities to people who are exposed to the radicalization that's out there on the internet and attempting to turn a single person or person alienated, disaffected for whatever reason into someone who's going to pick up a weapon, walk into a 7-Eleven and shoot people. That's really, if you were trying to scheme what ISIS is trying to do, that's what they're trying. We call it an inspired attack as opposed to a directed attack. A directed attack would be an attack in our homeland that ISIS has sent people here to do. They communicate with them, they set it up, they pay them. Look, if they communicate like that, we're going to know. Trust me, we're going to know. But you can't know about self-radicalization because it's broadcast. You see what I'm saying? It's out there. They're not necessarily ever going to respond to ISIS, yet they're going to be radicalized. The attack is probably not going to be the scope or scale of a directed attack where you got trained people with weapons. It's going to be one person, probably with one weapon, but still that's going to be tragedy at the place that it happens. I would say from entities like ISIS, that's more the danger than a sophisticated cyber attack right now. Okay? Good
Thank
question.
you, sir.
Sure.
One question I had, during Sandra's policy, she mentioned a centralized national cyber threat intelligence sharing network. From a defense standpoint, how would this improve or complicate coordination with the U.S. Cyber Command?
So what should happen if you stand up something like that? It ought to be outside of Cyber Command. It ought to be a civilian entity, maybe in Department of Homeland Security. There are a lot of different places you could put it. But defense would be a vector to give it information. It would come from defense and the agencies that work for defense, like DIA, the National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency would have a role. A lot of other agencies would fill that. And then it would have to have the authority to synthesize that information and to issue warnings. So that would be a new architecture that you'd need to stand up. But I would go back to a point I made earlier. The entity itself ought to be outside of defense. You don't want the Department of Defense doing that work because that entity will also have to look into the United States, and you don't want the Department of Defense looking in the United States. You know, there's popular myth that we do. We don't, believe me, I know. But the FBI can look into the United States. So because in order to be effective, you're going to have to cross that bridge and look in the United States. You don't want the Department of Defense doing that. But they can feed external information into a process that would then merge it with internal intelligence inside the United States to produce a non-military product that could give warning to this. So I think it's a good idea. It would not be cheap to do.
Another question I had was, what roles do alliances like NATO and Five Eyes play in our cyber defense planning?
So today, an extensive role. But look, I'm an internationalist. That's my training. That's my background. That's not in style right now. But I think that we need to maintain a relationship with NATO. I think we need to maintain a relationship. The Five Eyes relationship's a little bit dated. New Zealand is probably not the critical partner that it was in the Second World War in 1944. But nonetheless, those give you forward outposts. It gives you the opportunity to look at places where you might be attacked. So I think those are all useful things. And ultimately, they're for the good of the United States in order to maintain those relationships.
What do you think the biggest gaps in U.S. cyber defense strategy are today?
I think the biggest absence in our strategy is there isn't one. I think that really is it. It's a patchwork approach. We have, there are pockets of excellence across the U.S. government. There are broad vulnerabilities across the U.S. government. There's no clearly articulated national strategy, policy, red lines, deterrence measures. All those things are absent. And I think if I were going to say what's the biggest problem, I would identify that as the biggest problem.
Just building on the internationalist approach, and Sandra, I think your policy was great, very similar to one I presented earlier about standing up some kind of joint cooperation, whether it be a quantum threat or cyber threats. I was just wondering from your perspective, what allies did you feel as the most reliable in this domain, or who outside of us on our side is really leading, whether it be from a tactical or strategic perspective on that you think we can enhance cooperation with?
Sure. So you got to remember, you have allies that, you have partnerships that are deep, that touch on everything. The United Kingdom is probably one. Then you have ones that are more regionally focused. Saudi Arabia is one, certain matters, very important to us. Jordan, very important to us in certain matters. Israel, very important to us in certain matters. France, Germany tend to be more regional, not global, but nonetheless important partners. But it's like any other thing. In relations between states, it's got to be a cooperative process. We get something, they get something. That's the way it works. And we have pretty good relationships with every country that I've named and many others that I haven't named when it comes to sharing this type of information, because nobody wants a massive cyber attack and all that means. Sure, what is the greatest challenge? There's so many compartments of information classified at very high levels. Cyber command, because it came from strategic command, still has the artifact of nuclear command and control laid on top of it, which means it's highly procedural and can be very slow to make decisions. It's very frustrating sometimes to push for something, and you're debating, it's the old intelligence operator argument, and it's in a country where you need a legal opinion to do it, and it can take a while to get that. That was very frustrating to me as the Central Command commander. Good question.
In season 1 of Jack Ryan, featuring John Krasinski, the main antagonist, a terrorist, uses an online video game to impersonate his son, secretly communicating with his family in the U.S. under witness protection, gaining sensitive information he otherwise wouldn't have accessed. Given how younger generations are increasingly connected globally through online video games, how might the U.S. adapt to this to confront unconventional threats, where they could espionage, radicalization efforts, as we said, spreading misinformation. Our military already uses video games, like for recruiting. Might we start sending troops to like Fortnite, Roblox, games that have communication methods that could be used globally where we aren't like keeping track of that?
Sure, so you've identified a weakness. It's a weakness of a free society. We're always going to have that problem. I wouldn't want to solve that problem. I think the measures you'd have to do to stop that from happening would be perhaps worse than the threat itself. That's just me, though. Other people might have another answer to that. I'm just telling my own opinion. But I do think how you get after it is you get after it through education of the people that are actually playing the video games, so they have a broader base from which to draw than just sitting looking at a video game. You know what I mean? I play a lot of video games. I used to. I don't now, but I used to. My son, who's considerably younger than me, played and plays a lot of video games. But if you have a reasonable worldview to place the video game within, then it's no threat at all. But if the video game is all you're doing in your world, then of course you're very vulnerable to that. That's not a cyber problem. That's an education problem. And it's a family resiliency problem, I would argue, rather than strictly a technical problem. But a good question anyway. We are under threat from that. Yes.
All right. I have a question in the back. I just wanted to backtrack to one of your earlier statements in the discussion about it's not a matter of if, but when a cyber attack is going to happen to the U.S. So I'd love to get your perspective on what skills and preparations do you recommend for everyday citizens to learn and practice to mitigate damages to themselves, their families, for said attacks?
Sure. So first of all, keep your passwords updated. Make sure you've got dual factor authentication. Make sure that you're rigorously applying patches when you get them to your personal, to your iPhone, to your iPad, to whatever personal electronic devices you use. Take a look at that. I think as a citizen, that's probably the single best thing you can do. Don't have the same password be for everything. Use the password manager that's out there. There are a lot of things you can do to make your personal system work better, and that's really what a private citizen can do. That's all I can do. What localities and institutions can do is same thing. Keep your systems updated. Report it when it happens. But that's a little more difficult for an institution. I'll give you an example. I think USF has a pretty good system for defending its net. It's pretty good. I came from the Department of Defense, and I was impressed with how we did it, but I'm also very impressed with how USF defends its network architecture. They do a very good job of that. But you got to be suspicious of everything. Don't answer emails from people who are offering you $7 million, from some Caribbean country. Probably not you. That's wanted. So a lot of it is just common sense. The biggest weakness in cyber remains the human being, not the equipment. It's the person sitting in front of the computer, not the computer itself. That's the one thing I strongly believe that. And I remind myself that when I'm trying to update passwords, okay? Because it's painful, and I know and appreciate that. Good question. Thanks. Sure.
Thank you, sir. So my question is leaning more towards cyber policy and strategy in the military comparatively to the PRC, the PRA, and the MSS, the Ministry of State Security. In almost a decade now, they did a restructuring, moving their electronic warfare and their PSYOPs under one unit kind of thing. So comparatively to the United States and our approach to cybersecurity and defense, how do you see the pros and cons of each, and do you think that we should be restructuring our military to model something like that?
Yeah, so look, everybody in the world copies the U.S. military sooner or later. The Chinese they have a plan for 2047. Hitler had a plan for 1,000 years. That didn't work out well for him either. So the fact that the Chinese have done it doesn't mean much to me at all. I'm pretty comfortable with the way that we're organized now in terms of the way we organize cyber, in terms of the way we deal with our electronic warfare. I have great regard for Chinese capabilities, but they're not 10 feet tall. And they have many capabilities that they share with the Russians. And Russian capabilities have been exposed pretty thoroughly over the last couple of years in Ukraine, including their electronic warfare capabilities. They've gotten much better here recently, but it took them a long time to get better. So I'm pretty comfortable with where we are, to be honest with you. Now that may be a problem, so file that away. I could be wrong. I just spent a lot of time talking about how comfortable the Japanese and the Germans were, and we penetrated them. So bear that in mind as you sort of weigh my answer. But I think the U.S. Joint Force is the world standard for a lot of these activities, and I would not change simply because the Chinese did it.
Sorry, kind of going off of the same vein, and focusing more on the strategy and modern warfare aspect of this panel, do you feel that in the past few years our military strategy has evolved to really consider our cyber capabilities and the value of our cyber assets and the amount of damage that a well-timed cyber operation could have on our enemies or any other nation or state? And if not, what barriers do you think are preventing that shift and can be removed to move forward with that in the next couple of years?
Sure, great question. So I would tell you, as the commander of Central Command, I began my day thinking about cyber. I ended my day thinking about cyber. It was embedded in everything we did. Any plan that we developed had a cyber component, and it wasn't a bolt-on component. It was a fundamental component. For example, if I were looking to attack a country, I would look at non-kinetic effects that could support the kinetic attack. And sometimes we chose to only do non-kinetic, only cyber effects, just depending on the situation, depending on what the president wanted to do. But I would tell you that in today, cyber is embedded top to bottom in everything you do. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, but then cyber was still an emerging, 30 years ago, but then cyber was an emerging concept then. It's not an emerging concept now. It is fully equal as what we would call a battlefield operating system, the ability to achieve effects against the enemy. When you think about kinetic, you think about non-kinetic. When you think about firing a missile, you think, can I make this missile's path better by executing some kind of cyber attack on the enemy's air defenses? Just to use one example. At the same time, you're also worried very much about your own defense. How do you defend your own network from the inevitable attack of the enemy? So I would tell you, it is so fundamental now, fundamentally a part of what we do, that I think we're in okay shape with it. Now look, our systems may be a little dated sometimes, or they may be very modern, and there's problems there because you get a generational leapfrog. The other guys feel something that's really good. It takes us a while to catch up, but not real often on that. But it's a point worth watching, and I don't mean to sound like I'm satisfied, but we're in a pretty good space, I think. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Awesome. So my question is, you've mentioned a lot of different attack and defense vectors that the U.S. military and United States as a whole has to defend against: land, sea, cyber, and space. In current times, there's been a lot of internal degradation of those defensive principles and the organizations present to defend and properly utilize those vectors. How can modern analysts and people who are going to join the government, everyone who's in here, or at least in these front rows, how can we build proper cyber policies, strategies, and maintain a actionable plan for this modern irregular warfare while also balancing that uncertainty?
So first of all, you got to live with uncertainty. because the defining characteristic of warfare is uncertainty. There's an old saying, you train people for known situations. Like if you're going to fly an airplane, there are certain things about flying an airplane that, airspeed, if you screw around with your airspeed, you could die. That's a fact. That's not an arguable fact. That's a fact. However, there are uncertain aspects that you can't train to, that are open-ended, that don't have a clear answer. And that's what you educate to. So I come back to the most important thing of all is education. You got to have a broad education that can place things in context. Because look, the difference between being average and being really good is the ability to do pattern analysis. Anybody can look at a pattern, but can you look at a pattern and see, first of all, can you establish the formula? How do you want to look at the pattern? What are the things I want to look at? Then how am I going to measure change or not change in order to help me make a decision? As a general, that's how I spent my time trying to solve that problem. And so I would tell you, though, you get to it by having a broad education, by having a good understanding of history, and then by having technical competence. So if you're going to go into cyber, you got to know and understand cyber systems. But somebody who only understands cyber systems is not going to be prepared to execute. You got to place it in historical context. A guy that I worked for here at Central Command was a guy named Jim Mattis, who was a commander of CENTCOM before me, and then he was the Secretary of Defense. Some of you are familiar with that. He used to tell me about a thing called historical presentism. The idea that because it's happening now, it's the worst it's ever been because it's happening to me. Well, in fact, most of the situations that we confront even today, some analog of them has happened before. And you gain an understanding of how you address these problems by a study of history, by understanding prior situations that might not be exactly like this, but are somewhat like this. And that arms you with the knowledge you have in order to be effective. So if you're just going into this work, the one thing you want to do is you want to be good at what you do. You want to have technical mastery of the skill that you've been given to master, number one. Number two, you want to have a broad understanding of it. In order to change the system, you got to master the system. If you don't master the system, no one's going to listen to you. So you got to become knowledgeable, fluent in the system, and then that gives you the gravitas to make the changes that you want to make. Because change is inevitable, change is good. I don't mean to ever imply it's not. It's an interesting time to be entering this kind of profession right now because the world is very challenging. It's as challenging as it's been since really, I would argue, the interwar years between World War I and World War II. So there's a lot of opportunities for you. My time is ending, your time's beginning. I wish I were you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, General McKenzie, for all that. I definitely left here with a lot more information than I had before, and I'm very grateful for you showing up. We'll be here for questions afterwards, but I want to thank the audience for coming to our event today.